Guam's indigenous Chamorro people have staged a rally for peace, showing the world their culture and that for them the threat from North Korea continues to be very real. And as demonstrators gathered on the U.S. Pacific territory, its officials stressed the importance of American diplomatic efforts.
Thank you, General Dunford, for getting into harm's way. General Dunford is here not to push military plans. He's here for diplomacy. So I'm very reassured that General Dunford is doing that.
In Beijing, Joseph Dunford, chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, has stepped up calls for China to put pressure on North Korea, which for now is holding back from firing missiles towards Guam.
Days after China suspended part of its trade with the DPRK, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is pushing for greater diplomacy. Speaking with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov, Wang called on both sides to work together to promote peace and stability, saying nobody is allowed to stir up trouble on the doorstep of China and Russia. He added that immediate priority is to put the brakes on the war of words between the U.S. and the DPRK and prevent an August crisis. Lavrov noted that resolving the DPRK issue through the means of military force is unacceptable. He added that Russia would like to continue to strengthen communication and coordination with China and make joint efforts to defuse tensions. Speaking with Vice-Chancellor of Germany, Sigmar Gabriel, Wang said China is committed to a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and that joint efforts are needed in order to solve the crisis. Gabriel echoed Wang's views and noted Germany's support for China's double suspension proposal, which would see the DPRK suspending its nuclear and missile programs in exchange for the suspension of large-scale military exercises between the U.S. and South Korea. The Vice-Chancellor added that Germany is willing to work with China to continue to seek a peaceful resolution. As tensions and hostile rhetoric escalate between Pyongyang and Washington, Chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Joseph Dunford has called for China's help to broker peace with the DPRK. On a visit to Beijing as part of a three-nation Asia tour, Dunford said the U.S. is seeking a peaceful resolution to the crisis.
Another one, this one is about North Korea. Here it is. Kim Jong-un of North Korea made a very wise and well-reasoned decision. The alternative would have been both catastrophic and unacceptable. He's referring to the North Koreans backing off from their threat to launch missiles towards Guam. Mike Baker is with us this morning, former CIA guy. The president's making the point again. Show the North Koreans you can take them if you have to, and convince them that you are willing to do it. This is more of the same, isn't it? And I say it's a winning policy thus far. What say you, Mike?
Well, yeah, I think in large part what we're seeing now in terms of the North Korean regime backing off of their previous threat is the result of, and admittedly a little bit of this is speculation, I'm not sitting in the White House war room, but I think is a result of China and China believing that we this time are serious about enforcing the sanctions, holding their feet to the fire over ensuring that they, the Chinese authorities, enforce the sanctions. And also I think they were worried about the administration's view on the trade imbalance and what they may do there. So I suspect the Chinese were, at this point in the game finally, sat down with the North Korean regime and said, the system's changed, and they're not going to support them.
It's not over, though, is it? I mean, the missiles are still there.
No.
The bomb is still there. I don't know whether we've got an aircraft carrier there. I don't think we do. We've got an anti-missile system there. We're ready to shoot one down. The standoff actually just continues, waiting for something to happen.
Well, it does, and the danger here is what we've done over all these years, which is, kind of get to a certain point, the tensions are diffused to some degree, and then we focus elsewhere, and we kick the can down the road. They make a little bit more progress in their weapons programs, and then we find ourselves in another, point of tension. So, yeah, what do we do now? Well, I think the first thing is we have to keep the pressure on China. We have to ensure that these new sanctions, the newest round, are enforced. We have to call out the Chinese when they try to circumvent them, if they do, and we have to maintain that pressure. If the Chinese authorities actually do enforce the sanctions from their side, the North Korean regime, as I think it has been explained to them over the past few days, will feel significant pain, and that will threaten what Kim Jong-un's primary goal is, which is his maintaining leadership. So that could then lead us to a point where we could have significant talks about not only de-escalating these tensions, but possibly the denuclearization of the regime.
Well,
possibly.
I'd call that a plus, Mike Baker, and thanks for joining us.
That would be a plus.
Yeah, a huge plus. Thanks, Mike.
Well, we're quite upset about that. Frankly, I don't think it matters that much. It's just
so you don't
talk.
think he heard locked and loaded?
No, I don't think that was it. I think a couple of things. One, remember we heard the news about there being a back channel in New York directly between the United States and North Korea. I think President Moon's statement from South Korea is very welcome. I think the main thing, though, if I had to point to anything, would be the Chinese statement to the effect that if the United States starts it, they will not allow regime change in North Korea. They will not allow the North Korean state to be destroyed, and that if we do that, we're at war with China. And I think people take that seriously. But if North Korea starts it, he's on his own. And I think that sobered everybody up a bit.
Secretary Tillerson said that the sanctions worked. Is he right?
No, I don't think so. I don't think the sanctions really amount to that much. Even the sanctions that were passed in the Security Council, everybody made a big hullabaloo. Oh, the Russians and the Chinese signed on to. If you actually look at the details, it involved a lot of things that the Chinese have been doing for a very long time. Really nothing much changed.
So are we seeing China having an influence by saying that if the United States were to do a preemptive strike on North Korea, that they would side with Kim? I mean, is China now dictating to the United States how we defend ourselves?
I wouldn't want to look at it that way, and I would hope that President Trump and our national leadership is not looking at it that way. When all is said and done, Korea is way over there on the other side of the Pacific. The Chinese, the Russians, the South Koreans, the Japanese, they're the ones that are on the front line. They should be taking the lead here, and it seems to me that making a lot of threats and sanctions and so forth isn't any good for our interests.
But an intercontinental ballistic missile shortens the world a little bit.
It does.
I mean, it shortens the time frame. I mean, 20 minutes away from getting hit, if he has that capability.
If he has that capability. And something, you saw there have been reports casting some doubt on this report about a miniaturized nuke they could put on a long-range missile.
But who wants to take that chance?
Who wants to take that chance? And that's why, if things can be calmed down, frankly, I think the mutual freeze proposal from the Chinese is a valid one. They freeze their missile program. We freeze our exercise of Chinese and the THAADs. Why is that not a good deal for us?
Well, it sounds like a good deal, but how do we know that Kim is going to stop tests, and what if he continues one? What's our next move? What are the options?
Well, again, if the deal's on the table and both sides are rejecting it, we don't really know, do we? But if the Americans are willing to say, let's talk about that, what's the harm in it?
You think the door is open to talks now?
I certainly hope so. You know, this thing is a roller coaster. We were here before, we're down here today, maybe we'll be back up there again tomorrow.
But the president, the last few days, has cooled it.
Good. I'm glad to see that. And again, we know that he tends
I don't mean to interrupt you, but his proponents are say, hey, look, the tough talk on Kim worked. I mean, he's backing off. Sure. He's rethinking. He's looking at maps. He's not pushing buttons. Yeah, and of course, the North Koreans are coming out saying our tough talk worked and all that. I mean, again, the trash talk will continue. The question is what's going on behind the scenes toward hopefully some kind of a sane process forward. Jim Jatras, thank you so much.
I think there's no doubt that North Korea has been calling for a peace treaty with the U.S. since 1953, when an armistice, a ceasefire, was signed on July 27, 1953, between the U.S. and North Korea. So legally, technically, the war is still on. And the reason why the United States has never signed a peace treaty is because the United States doesn't really want to recognize the existence of North Korea. And that's what North Korea has always been asking for. So this whole nuclear missile fiasco could be dealt with if two things were done. Number one, the United States signed a formal peace treaty with North Korea. And secondly, the United States ended war games on North Korea's border and began to pull out its own 83 bases on the Korean peninsula.
And do you believe it's true that North Korea is not attached to having nuclear weapons if peace can be achieved?
I think that's absolutely clear. During the Clinton administration, they made very strong concessions to essentially stop their nuclear program. When George W. Bush became president, he pulled the U.S. out of that agreement. So once again, like the American Indians used to say, Washington speaks with a forked tongue. And that's been the experience repeatedly for North Korea.
And do you think peace between the U.S. and North Korea can happen? And if yes, how so?
Well, I think the only way it's really going to happen is if people in this country, America, begin to really understand something about the history of the Korean War, or as the North Koreans called it, the American War, and that people in this country begin to speak out to our government, demanding that they stop these aggressive military war games and base expansions on the Korean Peninsula. The United States is destroying communities in places like Songju, where a new missile defense system is going in that is a key element in U.S. first strike attack planning. And then in Jeju Island, just off the mainland of South Korea, a Navy base has been built, destroying a 500-year-old fishing and farming community to port U.S. Navy warships as part of this pivot into the Asia Pacific that we're told is to prevent war with North Korea. But in fact, I believe North Korea is ultimately a foil. The United States does not fear North Korea. North Korea only has 4 nuclear warheads today, while the United States has 6,800. So this whole pivot is actually being aimed at Russia and China. But the Pentagon doesn't want to come to the American people and say, oh, look, we want to move 60% of our military forces into the Asia Pacific to go after China and Russia. So instead, they use North Korea as the excuse. And so the more that the United States terrorizes essentially North Korea with war games and base expansions on the Korean Peninsula, the more North Korea reacts. And then the United States uses that as further justification to expand its military operations in the Asia-Pacific region.
And you're kind of touching on a question that I did want to ask you, because you wrote an article and it brought up the interesting question, will China and Russia get dragged into this dispute between the U.S. and North Korea? But you think that the actual dispute is not with North Korea?
No, I don't think so. In fact, this missile defense system that the United States, it's called THAAD, that is U.S. has recently deployed in Songju on the Korean mainland. Its radar has a 2,000-kilometer viewing capability, which means that it will see into China and Russia. So it's really not about North Korea. It's about, again, encircling China and Russia with military capability, and particularly these missile defense systems that are key elements in U.S. first strike attack planning. In fact, every year at the U.S. Space Command, they have an annual war game, a computer war game, where they practice a first strike attack on Russia and China. And after the U.S. launches that strike, those two countries try to fire their remaining nuclear retaliatory capability at the U.S. in response. And it is at that point that the U.S. uses this so-called missile defense shield to try to pick off Russian and Chinese retaliatory capability. So the U.S. is wargaming nuclear first strike and now setting in motion the infrastructure to make it possible.
战不消导致中暑，一些非战斗的警员让我们战斗力受到一些影响。之后的作战行动，我们班只能采取减员操作。 可以进行火力突击，也能够随机组合，担任不同的作战任务，利用灵活多变的战法，不间断地对目标实施火力突击。
At the U.S. Naval Institute. Captain, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you.
Tell us more about the significance of this agreement signed in Beijing. It's about improving communication between the two countries, especially on sensitive issues like the DPRK.
So China and the United States have a lot to work in common. You know, there are two largest economies in the world, very closely tied, but there's a lot of issues in East Asia and South Asia where we have friction. Our basic view about things on the Korean Peninsula is not 100% in agreement, although I think we agree right now that the problem with North Korea's ballistic missiles is a serious situation for both countries.
Do you believe, I have to ask you a question about the DPRK, do you believe the DPRK backing off somewhat from these threats of hitting waters near Guam, is that something that China had something to do with, or do you believe Donald Trump's tough rhetoric perhaps had something to do with it?
Probably both. I think the unanimous United Nations Security Council resolution a little over a week ago condemning North Korea's ballistic missile test had something to do with it. It was the first time there had been a unanimous resolution about this problem set. China has promised to strengthen its economic sanctions and stop trade with North Korea. That's significant. I think also what our president had to say had to, get some attention in Pyongyang.
Let's talk about the military alliance between Beijing and the United States. Clearly, as you mentioned, there are big differences when it comes to freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. So is it safe to assume there will always be those big differences? They are not going to see eye to eye when it comes to freedom of navigation, when it comes to the issues in South China Sea. So is it just a matter of managing those differences and managing the expectations?
I think so. A year ago, a little over a year ago, the Permanent Court of Arbitration for the United Nations Commitment for the Law of the Sea agreed that Beijing was wrong in its claim to the Scarborough Shoals in the South China Sea. There's overlapping economic exclusive zones in the South China Sea. The United States doesn't take a side in those disputes over territory in the South China Sea, but we do take a side that they have to be resolved peacefully, and they can't be resolved through military might or coercion. And the United States is military allies, has alliances with the Philippines, with Thailand. We have close relations with Malaysia and Indonesia as well. We have a military alliance with Japan, and there's a dispute with China over the Senkakus in the East China Sea. So these are things that need to be managed closely because the two biggest nations in the world cannot go to war over those territories.
What about areas of agreement, areas that these two nations do see eye to eye, including when it comes to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief? How important is that cooperation?
It's very important, and for about the last 10 years, China has participated in Task Force 151, the counter-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia, the Horn of Africa. They've integrated very closely with the international operations there. That's been a big part of cooperating with the Chinese military and with other militaries. There are agreements with the Chinese about fishing rights, about the importance of protecting the environment and protecting fish, particularly the prohibition against gillnet fishing, that sort of thing. So we're finding places where we can agree and where the two nations can work together and work under a UN rubric and a number of different problem sets.
And Captain, finally, how important is building trust and confidence?
It's very important. So during the Cold War, I worked for part of my career in the Pentagon. My office was right next to the red switch, so the people that connected Washington with Moscow. The ability to pick up a phone when there was a crisis is very important. We don't have that kind of a link yet with Beijing, but I imagine that that's part of this memorandum to agree, yes.
U.S. President Donald Trump is expected to sign a memorandum on Monday leading to investigations into whether Chinese trade practices force U.S. firms operating in China to turn over technology and their intellectual property. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying responded that China has been taking steps to better protect IP rights. She also said there is no future in a trade war between the two. The announcement followed a call on Friday night between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump, during which she urged President Trump to exercise restraint over tensions with the DPRK. So is Trump's decision over trade with China in any way linked to tensions on the DPRK? And by dredging up a trade policy deemed fashionable in the 1980s, Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974, will Trump succeed in reducing the trade balance between China and the United States? We are joined in Beijing by Mr. Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at the National Strategy Institute of Tsinghua University. Mr. Zhao, thank you very much for joining us. First of all, some analysts say Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act is outdated, unilateral and unfair, while some others say it's a powerful tool for the United States to cause great damage on China. What is your take?
Well, I think this really is outdated clause that produced during the Cold War years, 1974. And at this juncture, to use this again against China is specifically linked with U.S. intention to link China's trade practice with its strategy to exert extreme pressure on North Korea. And also, this clause has been used on China since 1989. There's been repeated using and potential sanctions against China using this clause. And over the years, even though with this clause, China and U.S. trade continue to grow, and this problem has been handled probably on the Chinese side because over the years, China has improved its intellectual property protection, and also at this point, China has fairly good protection of intellectual property of the U.S. companies within China. However, we're not saying that China is doing its best or has completed the mission of protecting IPR. And looking forward, I think China and U.S. should work together on this issue, not by U.S. unilaterally using this 301 clause against China.
Well, this is, as you mentioned, this is not the first time that this clause could be used on China. In the past, that we have seen some cases in different different industries of trade between China and the United States. What's so special about this potential one coming up possibly on Monday?
I think there are two problems. One is timing. At this point, we believe that President Trump and his administration has been holding back on using the 301 clause against China because of the North Korea issue, because the U.S. wants China's help, and in exchange, President Trump believes that on trade issue, he can cut some slacks for China. The second thing is that on Monday, I think specifically the United States might point at two industries in China. One is the microchips, and the other one is high-tech technology. So in these two, electronic cars.
Yes.
So in these two specific areas, China has been upgrading, climbed the ladder of value chain, catching up with the U.S. rapidly. And I think the U.S. is not really point at IPR infringement on the Chinese side, but also wanted to sort of contain and delay the China's progress in these areas.
Well, in history, this clause has also been invoked for other economies, for instance, against Japan, against Australia, against Brazil, actually against quite a number of countries. What is the difference between the U.S.'s intention or potential practice of this time compared to the previous times? We know these other economies were also relatively smaller, and these countries were politically more dependent on the United States as well.
Yeah. Well, I think if you look at the trade between U.S. and China, and if President Trump really wanted to address the problem of deficit, he shouldn't be looking at these areas. And as our Vice Premier Wang Yang visited U.S., he mentioned that if the United States lose the control of high-tech export to China, U.S. and China can cut its, the deficit by up to 24%. So I think at this juncture, U.S. looking at these two specific industries is really telling about China's progress on innovation and creation of high-tech technologies and its improvement over the years. Mm-hmm. So I think moving forward, U.S. and China can address this problem over the WTO mechanism, or we can talk about this and negotiate a mutually beneficial win-win situation solution.
Yeah, I'm told that we're just joined by Mr. Jeffrey Schott, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Mr. Schott, thank you very much for joining us. Please explain to us why the United States choose not to go to the WTO, where there is a widely acknowledged and respected panel of experts who are specialized in settling trade disputes, whereas choosing to invoke such a unilateral clause of its domestic law.
Well, it's very simple. The WTO is the preferred venue for handling trade disputes in areas which are covered by WTO obligations. But in this regard, there are many areas with regard to investment policy, with regard to intellectual property rights that are not covered by WTO rights and obligations, and therefore there's a gray area in the WTO rulebook that hasn't been filled, and that's why you have to through these bilateral means.
Now, past U.S. presidents have tried, at least ostensibly, to keep security and economic issues on separate tracks, but President Trump has explicitly linked the two, suggesting he would back off from a trade war against Beijing if Beijing does more to pressure the DPRK. Mr. Schott, what is President Trump's top priority here, and what's at stake?
Well, I don't speak for the administration, but essentially the actions that are being taken today are really the start of a process, and indeed a start of an investigation on whether to pursue consultations and negotiations to resolve long-standing problems. We've been dealing with these issues for a long time in the context of the bilateral investment treaty negotiations, and this is one of the reasons those negotiations did not conclude successfully. So I think this is another means of going back to the negotiating table, but before the United States can do that, we have to proceed through various processes, consultations with domestic advisors, before the U.S. Trade Representative can formally initiate an investigation.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, however, of this law, which is purely U.S. domestic law, being wielded against another country in trying to solve bilateral trade problems? I mean, if everybody just goes around and slash domestic unilateral actions like that against another country, I think the world trade will be in great chaos, Mr. Schott.
If there are unilateral actions that violate international trade obligations, yes, that's a problem and it should be countered. But what is being done right now, if you separate some of the political rhetoric from the actual measures and steps being taken, is the start of a study that would lay the foundation for consultations between sovereign nations. And I think as long as they are investigating the facts of the case before they start sitting down to talk about how to deal with problems, then I think we're handling it in a way that is consistent with the obligations of the World Trade Organization.
How do you look at the kind of practice we have observed from President Trump of linking China, of linking trade with China with the situation on the Korean Peninsula, Mr. Schott?
Well, I think there have been many different comments made from different officials in the White House. Essentially, trade has always been linked with foreign and security policy. You can't separate the two, even if some uninformed White House advisors say differently. But trade has consequences. Foreign policy problems will affect commercial relations. So I think this is why when President Xi Jinping and President Trump met together earlier this year in Mar-a-Lago, they recognized they had to deal effectively with each other in both areas, because